faithfully delivering value, interpreting great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally with the Book Talk. Today, we'll continue with the story of Empress Dowager Cixi. The last time, we talked about Empress Dowager Xian passing away, Prince Gong being dismissed, and all power falling into Ciqi's hands alone. And domestically, things were going well. It continued smoothly. The decade-long Taiping rebellion was completely suppressed, and the enterprises from the self-strengthening movement started yielding profits, so finances became more abundant. Logically, her future days should have been pleasant, but things weren't that simple. Internal issues were settled, yet foreigners started showing up. In her later life, Cixi spent most energy dealing with foreigners, especially since her 50th and 60th birthdays were ruined by foreign wars. In 1900, she faced the Eight-Nation Alliance invasion, which crushed her completely. She never regained her spirit, becoming deeply depressed until death. So, Cixi's later years were really uncomfortable. But despite that, she still prioritized holding on to power as the top task, never neglecting it. Kissinger once said power is the ultimate aphrodisiac, and that fits Cixi perfectly. Her obsession with power was uncontrollable. Even during foreign wars, she couldn't forget it, so the country suffered. After the Eight-Nation Alliance invasion, her mindset was depressed. She just muddled through things, but grabbing power remained unforgettable. And as a result, in her final years, the Qing regime grew increasingly isolated, directly leading to its downfall. Now, we'll explain these details for you. First, let's look at what happened when she was 50, the Sino-French War. Actually, this war was mainly because for a long time, there was a so-called suzerain-vassal relationship between Vietnam and China. The so-called suzerain-vassal relationship mainly has two aspects. First, when a new emperor ascended in surrounding countries, the Chinese emperor sent envoys to hold an investiture ceremony and confer the king's seal. Second, these countries had to periodically or occasionally pay tribute to China, meaning sending local specialties. And in reality, this leadership was more symbolic. For example, politically, China only required these countries to nominally acknowledge China as the leader. China basically didn't interfere in these countries' internal affairs. Of course, if you really run into a major issue that you just can't handle yourself, if you ask China for help, China will step in. Economically, each time these countries paid tribute, it was just a formality. They expressed a token of goodwill, but actually, China gave back way more in return. So these countries never came out short. Simply put, the cause of the Sino-French War was that France coveted Vietnam, and Vietnam saw it as something they couldn't handle alone, so they turned to China for help. Then China and France just went straight to war. Throughout the war, France had the upper hand overall, but couldn't score a decisive win. China didn't fight well at first, but later they gave France a real beating. In the end, both sides didn't want to drag it out, so they signed a peace treaty. The Qing Dynasty acknowledged Vietnam under French control. For Empress Dowager Cixi, the war's outcome mattered, but she had no time to dig into the nitty-gritty details and honestly didn't get it much. So she focused on how to use the war to grab power. At this point, Cixi's biggest foe was Prince Gong, Yishin. He'd been running state affairs for years, had high prestige, and often didn't see eye to eye with Cixi. This war gave Cixi the perfect chance. So what did she do? The old trick: use one faction to take down another. Who to use? The Qinglu faction. The Qinglu faction was a political group in the late Qing Dynasty. They thought of themselves as morally upright, prestigious, and outspoken, like a clear stream, hence the name. Actually, these folks did stick to their principles, believing China as a big nation needed its own bottom line, so they couldn't stand Prince Gong cozying up to foreigners and thought foreigners should be dealt with harshly. As we covered last time, the minister Shen Yu, who submitted that memorial, was a Qing Liu member. Cixi used Shen Yu's memorial to demand someone be held responsible for the defeat, thus kicking Prince Gong out. But as a savvy power grabber, after toppling one person, she still needed to find a replacement. For some matters, handling them directly herself was just too inconvenient. Cixi then set her sights on Yixuan. He was Prince Gong's brother, her brother-in-law, and super timid, perfect to replace Prince Gong. At the same time, Yixuan was handling quite a few duties. He felt that if Cixi stepped back, the emperor would take charge personally, and he'd have to give up his responsibilities, something he really didn't want to do. So he also supported Empress Dowager Cixi in grasping power. Although both sides had the intention, Cixi still distrusted Yixuan because Yixuan's biological son had become emperor at this time, Emperor Guangxu. If he truly monopolized power, Cixi couldn't have tolerated it. Therefore, Cixi felt she needed to make careful arrangements. Even if the emperor reached the age to rule personally someday, she could still retain real power. So, under the pretext of Emperor Guangxu's wedding, she misappropriated wedding funds to build herself a garden. This was partly for her own enjoyment and also ensured she kept control over palace affairs. Even if the emperor took charge, he'd still have to obey her, yet she still wasn't at ease. In 1887, Emperor Guangxu turned 17. According to rules, Cixi should have retired then to let the emperor rule, but she delayed for 2 more years until he married in 1889 before announcing her retirement. As for the Qing Lu faction, they didn't realize Cixi had used them as pawns. They actually thought their moral integrity swayed politics, so they kept chattering away. This finally angered Cixi, who decided to deal with them. How? Again, through this war on other suggestion, Cixi went along and sent Qin Liu generals like Zheng Peilin and Chen Baochen to the front to manage military affairs, intentionally setting these bookish types up for failure. Sure enough, these two soon faced misfortune due to military defeats. Chen Baochen was dismissed and Zhang Peilun exiled. Yet, someone still didn't know when to quit. During the war, a Hanlin Academy compiler named Liang Dingfen fiercely criticized Li Hongzhang for being too weak, leading Cixi to accuse him of slandering a minister and demoting him 5 ranks. What frustrated Liang Dingfen more was that this critique of Li Hongzhang was originally someone else's joke draft. Liang specifically asked for it, copied it, and submitted it himself, only to suffer greatly. Thus, Cixi used the Sino-French War to eliminate both Prince Gong and the Qing faction, tightening her grip on power. The First Sino-Japanese War 10 years later was somewhat different, though its cause resembled the Sino-French War. Like Vietnam, Korea historically had a suzerain-vassal relationship with China, and later Japan also wanted to seize Korea, thus sparking war with China. Throughout the war, China had virtually no fighting back. Whether on land or sea, Japan battered them senseless, winning the war with ease. The direct consequence of the war was that infamous Treaty of Shimonoseki, which we've all probably heard about in history class. Honestly, this war deeply shocked the Chinese people. Losing to Westerners was understandable since they were powerful. But Japan, this small country that Qing Chinese saw as always looking up to China as a model, now suddenly lording over them, unbearable for anyone. And moreover, this war directly revealed to imperial powers that the Qing Dynasty was hollow behind its facade, triggering their scramble to carve up China, further impacting its future. The book's coverage of the Sino-Japanese War mainly relates to the Navy Board. In 1885, the Qing government established a new agency, the Navy Board, claiming to vigorously build a navy to strengthen national defense. But what was its real purpose? Through first-hand accounts, the book reveals it aimed to split power from institutions like the Grand Council and Zhongli Yamen. consolidating control at the top. Strangely, the Navy Board also usurped power from the Imperial Household Department, which managed royal affairs, completely unrelated to naval matters. How could they mix? But later, Yixuan even assigned Lishan, head of the imperial household, to concurrently serve at the Navy Board, supposedly for smoother coordination. The real reason hinted in the book was Empress Dowager Cixi's long-desired garden project, repeatedly thwarted, mainly due to opposition and lack of funds. But naval development required huge sums. Linking the Navy Board and Household Department opened financial pipelines. What's mine is mine, and yours becomes mine too. So the garden project wouldn't lack funds. Historical records show in the decade before the war, garden construction cost approximately 6 million taels of silver, 4.3 million plus from Navy Board funds, with immediate consequences. The Beyond Fleet, China's main naval force, bought not a single new ship. Meanwhile, Japan desperately bought and built ships, forcibly expanding its navy. In a decisive battle, the Yalu River engagement, the Beijing fleet suffered total defeat, directly causing China's loss in the war. The book's description of the Navy Board and Imperial Household Department merging into one was a root cause. Ultimately, this was done to grasp power and money. So, if the Sino-French War saw CGU's defeat to seize power, the Sino-Japanese War was the opposite. Her power grabbing caused the defeat. Around this time, Emperor Guangxu initiated reforms, hoping foreign systems would strengthen the nation. This became the 100 Days Reform. Unlike common belief, Cixi initially supported it as ruler. She wasn't ignorant. Japan's brutal defeat deeply affected her. She felt national improvement was essential. But Guangxu was an impetuous young man, surrounded by similar personalities. Together, they acted rashly, pushing all reforms overnight for instant strength, alienating masses. For example, they proposed instantly abolishing old institutions, ending imperial exams, even canceling stipends for Manchu bandmen, forcing them to find work. This threatened officials, scholars, and bannermen's livelihoods, sparking widespread resistance. Protests erupted, growing increasingly disruptive. Cixi grew suspicious. Was Guangxu exploiting reforms to seize power? Once Cixi felt power threatened, national progress became secondary. She immediately imprisoned Guangxu and repealed nearly all reforms. This was the coup of 1898. Compared to the 1861 Sinew coup, it wasn't close. Cixi's power dwarfed earlier levels, while Guangxu paled against Prince Sishun. Post-coup, Cixi resumed control. For someone who lived for power, this should have brought joy. Yet, contemplating the future, she couldn't rejoice, being much older than Guangxu. If she became too frail, he'd regain power. Replacing him? Problematic. Whose son would the new emperor be? If it's counted as the son of Emperor Xian form, then Empress Dowager Cixi's status remains Empress Dowager, and she can legitimately continue wielding power. But candidates who fit this condition are all adults now. Once they ascend the throne, they can rule immediately as per regulations, forcing Cixi to obediently retire. So she looked among Emperor Tongji's descendants. But in that case, her identity becomes the emperor's grandmother, making it inconvenient to directly interfere in politics. Moreover, back when Emperor Tongji died, it was precisely this concern that led Cixi to choose Emperor Guangxu as successor. Since Guangxu and Tongji were peers, Cixi remained Empress Dowager. If she picked from Tongxi's descendants now, wouldn't that contradict her own precedent? Besides, candidates from Tongji's lineage were just young children at the time. Appointing a new emperor would require at least 10 years of grooming, but she was already elderly and lacked energy. Waiting another decade felt too uncertain. So changing emperors was postponed, and foreigners also objected. They felt changing emperors now would worsen chaos and damage their interests in China. Finally, Cixi compromised by selecting a child named Pujun as A-J, heir apparent. This essentially meant designated heir to the throne. Pujun was the son of Prince Duan Zai and was already in his teens then. His mother was Cixi's niece. So, leveraging this family connection, his parents desperately curried favor to secure this heir position for their son. By appointing this heir, Cixi still hinted at wanting to replace the emperor. But compared to immediate action, it was a clear concession. This displeased Cixi, who felt imperial succession was a family affair, foreigners had no right to interfere. And compounded by years of foreign meddling ruining her peace, her resentment deepened. Conservative ministers had long resented foreigners. For example, Zai Pujun's father fumed at foreigners' arrogance in China. His son's near imminent emperorship was sabotaged by them. Urged by these voices, Cixi decided to teach foreigners a stern lesson. Meanwhile, peasants in the north, angered by foreign aggression, spontaneously formed the Boxers. Yehetuan, Empress Dowager Cixi, and others decided to exploit this situation, secretly egging on the Boxers to fight foreigners, and it spiraled out of control. The Boxers not only hunted foreigners everywhere, but even ended up attacking the foreign legations in Beijing. According to international law, embassies are considered the territory of the country they represent. Attacking them is like declaring war. As a result, the involved nations formed the Eight-Nation Alliance and invaded China under the guise of rescuing their legations, easily capturing Beijing. Empress Dowager Cixi had to flee in panic to Xi'an. This was the Eight-Nation Alliance invasion of China. By then, she realized things had blown up. She had to give an explanation, or foreigners wouldn't let her off. Finally, after some effort, they signed that humiliating Boxer protocol. But for Empress Dowager Cixi, whether it was humiliating wasn't the big deal. What mattered was keeping her status and power. Luckily, she managed to shift the blame onto others, sacrificing those conservative ministers to save herself. But she didn't feel too bad about it because she'd always had doubts about those conservatives. And for example, Zai and his son were exiled to Xinjiang. Actually, Cixi hadn't liked him much before. Zai's dad was Emperor Daoguang's fifth son, while Emperor Xinfeng was the fourth. Cixi was never good to Zai's family. In Gao Yang's book, it's written that after Pujun became Da'a minus, he got all cocky and even beat up Emperor Guangxu once, making Cixi furious enough to consider deposing him. Hearing that, Zai thought about all the humiliation his family had endured over the years. He decided to seize the chaos to go all out and pull off something big. So he started earnestly urging Cixi to teach foreigners a lesson. But in reality, he had his own hidden agenda. The book describes his thoughts like this. Ever since being driven to Rahi by the Anglo-French forces, Cixi had suffered plenty from foreigners over 40 years. This time, by egging her on to kill all foreigners, he could let her vent all that rage. Then maybe she'd loosen her grip. Loosening her grip meant Cixi would stop running things. Then his son could become emperor right away, bringing his good times. This little scheme was naturally seen through by Cixi. And for Empress Dowager Cixi, who saw power as life itself, letting go was impossible. Anyone daring to think that would face bad luck. So, punishing Zai and others didn't bother her at all. But after the Eight-Nation Alliance War, Empress Dowager Cixi's state of mind was far worse than before, because this war made her realize foreigners were formidable and absolutely not to be provoked. Despite decades of thriving in power struggles, seeming confident and adept, just a few strikes from foreigners rendered her nothing. Especially this time, being driven by foreigners all the way to Xi'an, not returning to Beijing for over a year, and only after accepting humiliating terms, her dignity as supreme ruler was long gone. It was with this mindset that she entered her final years. During this period, she seemed apathetic, ignoring state affairs, just muddling through. But she still saw power as something she couldn't lose. On one hand, she started preparing for the emperor's succession. On the other, she grew increasingly distrustful of outsiders, believing only her own people could preserve the realm. And by her own people, she meant the Manchus, and outsiders mainly referred to the Han Chinese. This made the Qing regime increasingly isolated, hastening its downfall. First, let's see how she prepared for Emperor Guangxu's succession. This mainly manifested in finding a successor for Guangxu. Since being imprisoned, Guangxu became virtually useless, incapable of ruling and in poor health. Cixi knew this, so she began scouting for a new successor. But she feared acting too hastily, risking another uproar like the DH incident, so she decided to shape public opinion. First, she sent people to Yingtai to visit the imprisoned Guangxu, confirming if he was truly on death's door. Upon hearing the emperor had liver fire, poor complexion, and hadn't excreted for days, Cixi decided to summon ministers to Yingtai the next day to discuss state affairs. Of course, she had a plausible reason, missing him after so long as a family matriarch. But her real goal was to let ministers witness the emperor's condition themselves, making them realize he was unfit and a successor was needed. Since finding a successor required effort, she had to ensure she could keep holding power. Ultimately, she decided to appoint Pui, the last emperor we all know, as successor. At the same time, she declared Pui was too young, so his father Zaifeng would temporarily act as regent. This maneuver had its own cleverness. Empress Dowager Cixi preferred child successors. Zaifeng was Ixuan's son and Guangxu's brother. All three shared weak personalities. Thus, Cixi could continue controlling affairs through Zaifeng. But Cixi herself was terminally ill when making this decision. Within days, she herself died. For her, nothing mattered except power. Even at death's door, this remained unchanged. Speaking of this, you might recall a popular rumor. Cixi knew Guangxu was younger and feared after her death he'd regain power, so she allegedly poisoned him just before dying. Years later, tests on Guangxu's remains confirmed poisoning. So what's this book's take on the issue? The author posits, days before death, Guangxu had acute stomach pain, rapid heartbeat, darkened face, yellow tongue, coating, clear poisoning signs. Who poisoned him then? The author argues it wasn't Cixi. Her spies knew Guangxu was dying, incapable of ruling. She already knew this, making deliberate poisoning unnecessary. But with Cixi barely alive, her entourage, fearing retribution after her death, might have acted independently. Assuming Guangxu healthy, does this theory hold water? I trust you'll draw your own conclusions. All right, we've covered Cixi's power maneuvering regarding succession in her twilight years. Next, let's examine her favoring Manchus while distrusting Han Chinese. First evident in her wariness of Yuan Shikai, whose name invokes the 1898 coup, widely blamed on his betrayal. Actually, historical truth is clearer now. Cixi knew the plot before Yuan Shikai's reported betrayal, yet Gao Yang's book uses the traditional narrative, either unaware or accommodating popular belief. But Yuan Shikai's rise through the 1898 coup remains undeniable. During the later Eight-Nation Alliance invasion, Yuan Shikai gradually replaced Li Hongzhang as the top Han minister, and he was extremely shrewd. The book mentions that Empress Dowager Cixi once asked for recommendations of good doctors to treat Emperor Guangxu. Yuan Shikai initially wanted to recommend a doctor, but an advisor revealed he'd seen the emperor wearing worn-out boots, proof no one in the palace took him seriously. So, even with a good doctor, if palace staff ignored prescriptions and the emperor died, he'd be blamed. Yuan Shikai promptly abandoned the idea. For Empress Dowager Cixi, Such a shrewd, capable Han, like Yuan Shikai, had to be guarded against. When choosing Guangxu's successor, Cixi first rotated troops around Beijing, then sent Prince Qing Yiquan, then handling state affairs, on an external assignment. She knew Yuan Shikai wanted Yuklong's son, Zaifeng, as successor, with Yuan controlling armies and allied with Yuklong's family. If they joined forces militarily to make Zaifeng emperor, Qing rule would fall to Han hands. To counter Yuan, Cixi excluded Han and favored Manchus in key positions. For example, department heads were mostly Manchu, with few Han. This bred Han minister discontent. Zhang Zidong, renowned Qinglu figure then on the Grand Council, felt his seniority entitled him to advise Cixi. Cixi denied bias, claiming past fixed Manchu-Han position ratios proved fairness. She omitted that ratio limits had guaranteed Han posts. Abolition removed safeguards, letting Manchus flood key roles. This isolation deepened the regime's isolation. By Cixi's death, Han led only 4 of 12 central ministries. Key departments were entirely Manchu-staffed. Some lamented, the Han are now isolated. Others corrected, it's the bannermen who isolated. The greatest damage Cixi inflicted before dying. That's the gist of the book covered for you. But this isn't the whole story of the book. The work spans 10 volumes using Empress Dowager Cixi as the core to explore nearly every significant political figure of late Qing China. So you can approach it as an expose of late Qing politics, offer Gao Yang's deep familiarity with the era shines, and many character stories are absolutely riveting. You'll discover power schemes, human nature, and other profoundly thought-provoking elements within. In this biography, Cixi sometimes vanishes entirely, while other figures drive the narrative through their struggles. Yet you'll subtly sense her lingering influence before the plot inevitably returns her to center stage. Thus, this isn't a conventional biography. It's more accurately an encyclopedia of late Qing political turbulence. All right, that concludes our exploration of the complete biography of Empress Dowager Cixi. Listener notes are below the audio. We'll meet again tomorrow.